Everyone, hello and welcome to the third and last meeting of the Turba online program for spring 2023, which of course addresses the history of alchemy broadly defined. As you may have seen, this spring we have been discussing a variety of subjects in alchemy, including late antique, medieval, and early modern, and ranging from late antique Greco-Roman Egypt to the 17th century, respectively. Today's session on Thomas Vaughan and the issues of spiritual alchemy. We are, of course, fortunate to have secured the support of the Society of the History of Alchemy and Chemistry, which is providing its Zoom account for our use. I should add that this session is broadcast live on the Shack YouTube channel. So I'm your host, Jo Hedison from University of Oxford. And as always, I will be taking questions either in the chat or by raising your hand virtually or by posting in the YouTube chat if you'd like to ask a question there. I am aimed to keep the meetings to a maximum of 1 hour. So let me introduce our speaker today, Thomas Willard from University of Arizona. And Tom taught English and religious studies at the University of Arizona until 2022 and is now retired. Tom earned his PhD in English from the University of Toronto, and this is the interesting thing that his supervisor was the critic Northrop Frye, on whose work he has prepared an edition and has published more than a dozen essays. Tom's most recent books are Reading the Natural World in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, published in 2020, and the book we will be discussing today, Thomas Vaughan and the Rosicrucian Revival in Britain, published last year with Brill, 2022 with Brill. And Tom will talk about Thomas Vaughan and the problems of spiritual alchemy. So Tom, if you would like to take over, please do so at your convenience.
Well, thank you very much, Jo, for your introduction. Thank everyone for coming. I appreciate your interest. And as I set up, I will ask you if you would to make note, mental or in the chat or on your paper, of any preconceptions you have of spiritual alchemy, what you think about it. And I will be talking about some problems that the term raised for me in writing and writing again about Thomas Vaughan and alchemy. As Jo just said, I'm a former professor of English and religious studies at the University of Arizona. I'm not really a historian of alchemy so much as a historian of ideas, and specifically modern ideas and or early modern ideas and literature. So I might tell you that I proposed to write a PhD thesis in Toronto about Thomas Vaughan. It was accepted as a topic, I think, though I had to defend it before a panel as part of my PhD exam. I think it was accepted because Thomas Vaughan was the younger brother, twin brother of Henry Vaughan, the English metaphysical poet who wrote religious poetry in the manner of George Herbert. Thomas's interest in alchemy and Hermetic philosophy very much influenced the symbolism of Henry's poetry and Henry's choice of translation, which was or included medical texts by Heinrich Nollius, a Paracelsian chemist and professor in Gießen and elsewhere in Germany, who was the first German to be put on public trial for admitting to affiliation with the Rosicrucians. So I first should tell you something about the two Vaughan twins. The main thing here at the beginning is that their lives, like the lives of many of their contemporaries, were profoundly affected by the English Civil War in the 17th century. They were born in Wales, they were Welshmen, right at the time that the reign of James I was ending and the succession of Charles I beginning. James had taken as his policy to try to keep on good terms with all in Europe, that of marrying his older child, Elizabeth, to a Protestant elector in the south of Germany, and his younger child, Charles, to a good Catholic in the royal family of Spain. The marriage to the Infanta of Spain was never popular in England. And when this was brought together with Charles's belief in the divine right of kings, including to tax, he was set up for a major conflict with the very largely Protestant parliament. Thomas graduated from Jesus College, Oxford, only weeks before the outbreak of civil war. Henry, at the same time, had been clerking for the Chief Justice of a court of great sessions. They both came into the war, as Wales tended to come, in support of the monarch. They both saw combat duty. Thomas was captured, and their known affiliation with the king pretty well destroyed their careers. Thomas at his parish in Wales and his college in Oxford, where he had become a fellow probably, and Henry in the courts. So they both found themselves in the year 1650 needing to find new employment. They both turned to medicine, where the main requirement in those days was the ability to read Latin and follow medical advances. Many of their medical books are now in the Library of Company of Philadelphia, and I have shown in the book as the first illustration Thomas's signature and motto in a recent book of anatomy published in France, but written in Latin. His motto, by the way, could be translated, "God leads, nature follows." So he did not subscribe to the view that religion and science had nothing to do with each other. As a priest, especially, he thought that nature was a book of God, and one would learn from nature about God and God's creation. Between 1650 and 1655, Thomas wrote and published 8 book-length essays. He called them discourses, but the modern English usage of essay to mean not attempt, but written work had not really come into English at that point. Only Francis Bacon had used the word that way. I'll go back here a couple of slides. Vaughan married briefly and attests to his wife's participation in his chemical operations in a notebook of alchemical observations, which he calls natural secrets. His fortunes changed after the restoration of the monarchy. He became closely affiliated with the captain of the Scottish Guard that had protected Charles in his exile, Charles II. His friend Robert Morey was one of the first Freemasons inducted anywhere, but in Scotland specifically. And because of the Welsh and Scottish affiliations here, I have made the last minute decision to situate this Rosicrucian revival of ideas, which had very largely faded out during the 30 Years' War in Germany and throughout Europe, to situate that not in England, but in Britain. Vaughan probably died while staying with Moray in Oxford during the Great Plague of 1665, 1666. And now I want to come to the complications of Vaughan's alchemy. What led me from a proposed thesis on Vaughan and alchemy to a book 50 years later, believe it or not, on Vaughan and the Rosicrucians. This is really a post-retirement project of mine. In Vaughan's first book, he wrote very glowingly about Agrippa as his author, that is, his authority. And he had probably used this first edition, which would be at the Bodleian Library. The Bodleian has records of his book requests up to 1649. Agrippa's 3 books are organized to cover the natural world in the first book, where the science is of alchemy, the celestial world in the second book, where the chief science is astrology, along with numerology. And it's important for our discussion, I think, to note that Agrippa, following Renaissance Neoplatonism, identifies the celestial world as also the spiritual world and the site of imagination, which connects the 3 worlds. In the third world, he discusses Kabbalah in the manner that Pico della Mirandola and Johannes Reuchlin had Christianized it as the dominant science. Vaughan picks up on this too and has many references to Kabbalism. We can come back later in the discussion to the thought process through which the magician or magus is able to proceed from one world to another. Vaughan's first book further complicates the matter of alchemy by dedicating itself to the illustrious and truly regenerated brothers of the Rosy Cross. I was naturally rather confused about all of this, but in fact, many others were following Vaughan in situating the Rosy Cross in connection with alchemy, as happens in the first English language edition of the Rosicrucian manifestos. Jocelyn will be intrigued by the suggestion that the manifestos may have been translated from Latin by Robert Flood. I found in my research, using the wonderful work of Elias Ashmole's biographer, that Vaughan had access to Flood's library, as it had gone down to his nephew, and various manuscripts and books were borrowed from it by Vaughan's friend, Robert Child. It's quite possible that either Ashmole's translation or Ashmole's autograph copy, I should say, of manuscripts from Flood's library were among the papers that came to Vaughan when he was asked not to edit at all, but simply to present the Rosicrucian manifestos in 1652. Vaughan's Anthroposophia, by the way, which takes its title, Anthroposophia, from Flood's defense of 1629. And to me, in the wisdom of God planted in the soul, this is not a tabula rasa view, such as John Locke put forward. Theomagica, I believe, first appeared in a work by Heinrich Kunrath to mean the power of God in the creation. At any rate, these things began to make better sense to me later in 1972, when I defended that thesis proposal at my PhD orals and writtens, and then found soon after Francis Yates's newly published book on the Rosicrucian Enlightenment. Yates was problematic for many authors, or readers, but included many valuable insights, I think, as her great defender and one of her first reviewers, Pick Walker, pointed out. And one of these insights is that the stress on Magia, Kabbalah, and Alchemia was in some ways combining to form a religious philosophy that promised a new dawn for humanity. This was very helpful to me. We find that combination of magic, Kabbalah, and Alchemia in the work of Robert Flood, we've mentioned. But where spiritual alchemy really entered the picture for me was with the first modern edition or of all of Vaughan's works by Arthur Edward Waite, published in 1919 by the Theosophical Society. Waite had edited Vaughan's first four essays in 1888. And it was the same year that he first came across a copy of a very influential book of the 19th century, Marianne Atwood's Suggestive Inquiry into the Hermetic Mystery. It was there that Waite came across the concept of spiritual alchemy, though I think he had also seen the term spiritual alchemy in the work of Eliphas Levi, some of which he had translated. But for whatever reason, Waite never explained exactly what this meant, or even whether Thomas Vaughan was aware of what it meant to his interpreter, Marianne Atwood, who has a number of quotations from Vaughan and translations of texts taken from Vaughan. I think the best way to understand exactly what spiritual alchemy meant for Atwood, who was also talking about mesmerism and other things, would be to look at Mike Zuber's book from 2021, Spiritual Alchemy from Jakob Böhme to Marianne Atwood. So here we get to the first of my problems with the term spiritual alchemy. One, if you look at this chart prepared from the Google Books database, you'll see that in 1850, when Atwood's book appeared, there began a spike in the term, which spiked again and increased just after 1900 as Yeats's translations of individual texts, or I'm sorry, Waite's translations of individual texts were coming out. But you'll also see that the biggest spike until very recently was 75 years before Atwood's book in the late 18th century. What happened was that at this time, when people were talking about spiritual alchemy, alchemy was being used in a figurative or metaphorical sense to mean something like the presumed magical transmutation. It was an analogy rather than an actual identity. A good example of this comes from an essay by Samuel Taylor Coleridge in his collection, The Statesman's Manual, 1616, 35 years approximately before Atwood. He is writing about applications of biblical statements in political and social occasions, and writes here about a grace that enables people to look at what seem like rather negative, dangerous ideas and find good and use in them. This is a spiritual alchemy, says Coleridge, which can transmute poisons into a panacea. Coleridge was a friend of Sir Humphrey Davy, but was not a chemist, nor was Waite, who thought that Vaughan must be using alchemical terms symbolically and would talk about the veil of symbolism that stood in front of spiritual alchemy, which seemed to him to be what you would get if you joined his semi-Masonic lodge, the Order of the Fraternity of the Rosy Cross. So I'll go on a little farther here and point out that this use of alchemy in a figurative sense, which the Oxford English Dictionary has traced back to the 16th century, had some definite examples in Vaughan's own day. One of them being this book called The Spiritual Alchemy, The Spiritual Chemist, rather, providing 60 meditations. And the author, who was the Thomas Young of the Smectymnus books, talks about the skill of a good minister, as Young was, to have the ability to spiritual all objects and provinces and to turn everything by a divine chemistry into spirit and nourishment. So this kind of alchemy was interpretive alchemy. But when it was spiritual alchemy, there was always the possibility of skewing the spiritual side. So in 1659, when the scholar, son of a greater scholar, Marek Kasaban, edited the spiritual diaries of John Dee, as they are sometimes called. He associated the spirits who came to Dee and Kelly in their scrying sessions as devils in disguise and called those devils spiritual chemists. Well, to see how far these uses of spiritual alchemy can go, and we've seen that it's had a recent peak of popularity, we need to go back to the Waite edition and the introduction written in 1968 to the first reprinting of that 1919 edition. This is the reprinting that I used, and this is the introductory essay in that edition. Rexroth, who was a San Francisco poet, a member of the New American Poet group there, maintained in the introduction that Thomas Vaughan, of all writers on alchemy, really gave away the show, but that Waite, for whatever reason, probably because of his membership in various secret societies, felt obliged to hide Vaughan's secret. Rexroth said that he could reveal Vaughan's secret, the real alchemy that Vaughan was talking about. And he could do so because he had noticed the frequency of the use of words like sperm and seed, and Vaughan's memories of his wife and collaborator in chemistry, mentioned in the appendix to Waite's edition. He thought that the Vaughans were practicing sexual alchemy of a sort that had been tried in India and China for generations, for centuries. And his book inspired the first complete book on Thomas Vaughan, which almost made me determined to turn my old thesis into a book. Peter Levenda, Jocelyn may know him, an American esoteric writer on Hitlerism and other things, wrote a book describing Vaughan as the tantric alchemist, someone who had intimate knowledge of the Indian tantric tradition a full century before Sir William Jones formed the Asiatic Society and became the first person to hypothesize the Indo-European language tradition, also to set the stage for translation of Sanskrit texts in the 19th century. Quite an accomplishment, and yet the term has gone even farther. We can see it being used for spirit communication of the sort that Dee and Kelly did, and by a lifestyle coach for self-love and the alchemical law of attraction. But I think we need to go back a bit. The Polish alchemist, Polish student of alchemy, I should say, though he may do more than that, Rafał Prinka, has maintained that, in fact, the philosophical alchemy did follow the practical alchemy. And he cites the group in Baghdad around the figure, literal or pseudonymous, of Habir ibn Hayyan, al-Hayyan, I'm sorry, who felt that if the Byzantine formulas didn't produce the results they promised, one needed to go back and rethink the nature behind these transformations. I think a similar thing occurred in Europe when the Arabic texts were translated into Latin in the 12th and 13th centuries. And groups like that around the name of Ramon Lull, principally in Montpellier, felt the need to think about the theory of alchemy. One of Vaughan's favorite books from the Middle Ages is the Testamentum of Ramon Lull, this pseudo Lull, which the best student of the Lullian corpus, Michela Pereira, has described as by far the oldest and most important of the alchemical writings attributed to Lull. We had an excellent presentation on the codicil to the Testamentum last time. And indeed, Vaughan took from the main text, the Testamentum, one of Lull's, pseudo-Lull's diagrams. He also took from the Testamentum especially that discussion of the radical humidity. But I think an important point to make about the Testamentum is that the theory, the Theorica, is 4 times as long as the practical writing, the practica. And this proportion of theory to practica, I think, is very close to that in Vaughan. The great many of his alchemical assertions are of a theoretical nature, probably on the principle that if one hasn't got the principle down, one has no business trying to perform the operation without the guidance of either a master alchemist or God himself.
Tom, you told me
How
to
are we
tell
doing?
you around, around 31 minutes or so.
Oh,
Yeah.
31 minutes. Well, then let me very briefly go through and suggest one other point about spiritual alchemy. For Vaughan, who very much believed in the spiritual world, connecting the elemental and the angelical, any operation had to be made between the two worlds, between the natural world and the spiritual world. So when he has a tract on the first matter, he calls it Caelum Terrae, the heaven of earth. But then he asserts that the first matter is both Caelum Terrae and Terra Caeli, the earth of heaven, not this dust and dirt, but an invisible spiritual object. That's the part of spiritual alchemy that Renaissance Neoplatonic aspect that I think is very largely missed by the greatly scholarly Waite, who went on to assert that Vaughan is the outstanding English example of spiritual alchemy. So he presents a problem to us. I might speed on. I have other slides. I could point out that one of Newton's favorite books, as pointed out by scholars, including Bill Newman's recent book on Newman, was a book that promised to take the first matter back before the planets as well as before the elements. It was very much a spiritual book of the sort that Vaughan liked, and one of Monty Snyder's alchemical books has often been attributed to Vaughan, just because people didn't translate the title Chimica Vaughanus as the chemistry of the winnowing fan, rather than the chemistry of Thomas Vaughan. But I will leave us there, and I would love to hear any questions or comments. So let me exit the screen here.
Okay, thank you, Tom, for this very interesting introduction and presentation on Thomas Vaughan, who of course is quite a controversial figure in very many ways, and he probably was. I mean, he was obviously during his lifetime as well. Oh, Rafael is here. I see. I hope he can join us as well. I'm quite curious in what your views are on this problematic of spiritual alchemy, in the sense of what precisely. I mean, obviously, not going into the tantric side of it, but basically, what is an alchemy practiced as in a spiritual way, or what is spirit in the first place? It's a big and can of worms, right? So.
Well, I agree. When I showed the slide on Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy, which was really magical philosophy, I mentioned that Agrippa sees a way that one can proceed. In the first paragraph of the first book, he says the 3 worlds are related as superiors to inferiors. But when he gets into the 3rd book, he finally gets to the structure of the human mind. And he says that imagination is the way through, that imagination is a higher faculty than reason. Paracelsus picks up on this. Paracelsus was well familiar with that book, and indeed called imagination a great secret power, while reason was a great public scandal. Vaughan places imagination in the world of the spirit, in this higher world. He's very close in that sense to Gerard Dorn, whom I didn't have time to discuss, but who has a book of 1567, roughly, when he was just beginning to translate works of Paracelsus, in which the first half is on the chemistry in the laboratory. The second half is on the philosophy behind the chemistry. And just as there are 7 steps in the alchemical process, there are 7 steps in the mental process, which is very close to a description of meditation for him, that somehow the mind is able to travel these distances. When Vaughan was invited to speak about Jakob Böhme, where Mike Zuber begins his book, he said, many wonderful things have fallen from his pen, but when he gets to the actual work, there it makes no sense. And this very much is what Böhme himself writes in a letter to his friend Paul Keim, that he knew the philosopher's stone, but not from experimentation. He knew it from imagination and a powerful hope. So there is that element that the chemist in the laboratory is also working with something invisible, something that comes not from the natural world, but from a higher world. This made him at odds with many of his contemporaries. His friend, who was very active with the Royal Society, a good friend of Robert Boyle and conducting experiments with Boyle, was part of a group that said its aim was natural knowledge, knowledge of nature, where Vaughan had said he was writing what had always been for him natural secrets. There was a real difference between the new chemists who wanted to make all things public and repeatable experiments, and the old alchemists who believed that these were to be shared only with other adepts. The real issue for the Rosicrucians was that they claimed to have great knowledge of alchemy, but to disdain those vulgar chemists who did not have spirit and were not making alchemy part of a religious practice. I'm sorry, that's a long answer. And I know, Joe, you have written very well on a transitional figure, J.B. van Helmont, who wanted, like many of Robert Flood's contemporaries, to use the chemistry and the chemicals of Paracelsus and Paracelsians, but to sort of let go of that philosophical apparatus that you find in the late works of Paracelsus, like the cosmology of his, what is it, about the planets and so on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's, well, with von Helmont is obviously a big, complicated issue because, of course, he was, you know, he had this problem of, obviously, with the Inquisition, and well, he was very much supportive of natural magic, at least in his youth. He became, he didn't mention the word anymore after he was imprisoned, so he was much more, yeah, I mean, whether he changed his mind or he was just more guarded, that's the big question. But once you go through house arrest and that kind of thing, you think twice about what you put on paper.
Yes.
And I mean, obviously Thomas Vaughan was living in a Protestant country and in a different period, so it was a bit different in that sense.
Yes, and he was living at a time when the system of censorship, which was very strong before the Civil War, had not really been put back in place.
Yeah, I mean, this is quite interesting about this period, this flourishing of all sorts of ideas that happens during the Civil War. And I think it's, yeah, Thomas Vaughan is quite interesting in I mean, even in this idea of defending the Rosicrucian brothers, you know, where everyone was censoring them around Europe, so he was quite brave in that sense. So and of course he was taking the mantle from Robert Flood, right? So it was like picking up the fight and taking it onwards. So
I think this is very common, that authors don't directly say, I have this debt. He has a great debt to John Dee, who also believed that alchemy was performed as the lower astronomy, that there was a connection between worlds. He rather conceals that. Paracelsus conceals his own debt to the De Vita Triplici of Marsilio Ficino, which he very much responds to in books like his two on the long life.
well, I would like to open up the discussion. I can see that there's quite a few people that have worked on different subjects. Well, whoever wants to ask a question, they just have to raise their hand in chat, or I mean, I'm actually, you know, because I saw Rafal is here, and of course I'm quite interested in the influence of Sendivogius on
yes.
On
Sendivogius was one of Vaughan's favorite authors, one of the two moderns that he recommended, along with Jean d'Espagne.
Because it is interesting, because Sandivogius obviously has this kind of vision of like kind of macrocosmic vision of alchemy as being, you know, this kind of integrated in this kind of huge cosmological and I think it's quite interesting whether the Euphrates, I think it's quite close to Sandivogian
Yes, that's
alchemy.
especially close, and also to Lowe, because Vaughan had picked up from the codicil the emphasis on the radical humidity. That's in fact part of the subtitle of his alchemical notebook. But he very much picked up on Sandivogius' theory of nitre, aerial nitre.
Yeah, I mean, it's I'm also wondering about this pseudo-Lollian influence. I mean, you're you're referring to this kind of proportion between the theory and the practice that is similar to pseudo-Lol. And I was just wondering if you, to what extent do you think he was a practitioner, and to what extent he was, basically, when you think about also about that Kunrat image of, you know, the ora et labora, the prayer and the work, how the proportion works, you know, how much you spend in the oratory and how much you spend in the laboratory is an interesting question, especially when you think about this period. So.
Yeah, I think Vaughan was writing about alchemy before he really had the opportunity to practice. He didn't really have the opportunity to practice until he was living in London and in connection with friends like Thomas Henshaw, who maintained a laboratory. Then he established his own laboratory when he was married and living outside the city limits, so outside the limits where the College of Physicians or the Society of Pharmacists would be after him. And then at the end of his life, he had a laboratory in Whitehall where his friend Robert Morey was living. And then they had Boyle's laboratory in Oxford as well. So I think he moved increasingly toward belief that his books might make sense in some future age, but not to his contemporaries.
Yeah, it's actually quite interesting. Obviously, Thomas Henshaw being, you know, involved with the Royal Society quite closely, and Robert Morey, of course, being a member and all that. But at the same time, Thomas Vaughan kind of kept away a little bit from it. It's an interesting aspect.
But I found very interesting in William Newman's new book on Newton that after Boyle died, Locke and Newton swore each other to secrecy about their alchemical experiments with Boyle and promised not to give away Boyle's alchemical notes. As Thomas Vaughan's cousin, who collected all those wonderful stories about various people of his time, wrote, Boyle would not spare money to get any alchemical secret he could come across. He may have been somewhat bilked by George Starkey in that sense, but they thought that they really had something that was going to be performed, and yet maybe it shouldn't be shared with everyone. But if anyone was going to discover the Philosopher's Stone, it had better be an Englishman. That was Newton's thought.
Yeah, I mean, Newton was definitely very careful. I mean, let's
Yes.
put it this
Yes.
way about sharing. And I mean, I think this tension still it's still strong. I mean, obviously you have people like, I mean, Boyle is a good example, because obviously he in one way he's talking about, like, let's say, let's talk publicly, you know, let's share secrets, but then again he doesn't share all his secrets, and he's in contact with this, you know, as Larry Principe showed in his book on Boyle, with this kind of esoteric groups, and there were and he was very keen, obviously, to know all these secrets.
Yes.
It's interesting, because this tension still is there, and it's becoming, actually, I think it's becoming more acute towards the end of the 17th century. This idea that, you know, some of the higher secrets should are not pertaining to public knowledge. It's interesting in that sense.
Yes. Well, I've proposed calling Thomas Vaughan a theoretical alchemist on the model of the theoretical physicist, but he called himself a speculator. And the idea of speculative alchemy, another term that actually came into the language in the same decade as spiritual alchemy came with Marianne Atwood's book. Speculative alchemy arose in the preface to the first modern edition of the notes of Roger Bacon. And it has continued as the term theoretical alchemist has persisted across the years, but at a much lower extent than spiritual alchemist, which can be used in finance. You know, you do your spiritual alchemy with your money and many other ways. I think that just as there has been a lot of theorizing and often Eastern ideas in physics, we're seeing more of those also in biology, because biochemistry is coming to have so much influence now. My late wife was a pharmacist, a pharmaceutical chemist, and I learned a lot of theory from her that I think might not be so far from the old alchemists.
Interesting point. And obviously it's an interesting aspect. I mean, speculative alchemy, it has a bit of a different connotation, I guess, than spiritual alchemy. But it is interesting, because obviously he keeps a connection with the practice. I mean, it's not he's not removed, you know, in that sense. But he's spending a lot of time thinking about this kind of questions.
Yes. Meanwhile, unlike Yeats, Waite, he was not concerned with membership. He thought of Rosicrucians as books. He said, unless books are written by something other than man, there must have been Rosicrucians. And the Rosicrucian manifestos say, many people are very like unto us who read the Bible as a guide to the world.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, because obviously for them, it's probably the Rosy Cross is more like a symbol. It's like something to to be referred to. And when he's creating the chemical club or this kind of groups, they're trying to use the ideas behind the Rosy Cross.
And the chemical club is modeled in many ways on writings about a kind of utopian society by the author of the principal author of the Rosicrucian Manifestos, as he has appeared, J.V. Andrei. Those in turn were influenced very much by Johann Arndt, the so-called father of German, or grandfather of German pietism. So a lot of these ideas that there's something more than your science out there continue. It wasn't specifically Christian, but it was definitely anti-clerical.
Okay, I'm mindful of the time.
Good.
And unless someone has a burning question, I would like to thank Tom for giving us this introduction and for calling us to read his book in a way. So it is I don't know if you've showed the book when you're in your talk, but he has this very interesting book on Thomas Vaughan coming out last year in Brill in the Aries collection. And so I would encourage you to get that and read it, because definitely Thomas Vaughan is a very, very interesting figure and quite transitional in a way, and quite influential later on. Thank you, Tom, for opening up the discussion about spiritual alchemy as well, which is it's still a very interesting and very current debate, of course, especially since Mike Zuber wrote his book. So, I want to thank everyone who participated and for all the Turbas as well, for the last three that we hosted. I hope that we will be able to resume the Turbas. Probably, I'm not sure I can do it in the spring, because I'm also organizing another seminar session, which is in person in Oxford. But in autumn for sure. So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Tom. And have a nice spring break and the rest of summer as well. And thank you.
Thank you.